Peace be upon you, class. Let me first express my appreciation for your engagement and positive interaction on Google Classroom with the task which I assigned to you about classical Marxism. In this recording, I share with you brief answers to the enclosed questions. The first question: who is Karl Marx? Karl Marx is obviously enough the founding father of Marxism. He was a German philosopher, a political economist, a journalist, and a political activist who lived in the 19th century. He fled, or rather he was exiled from his native country, Germany, to Paris, and from Paris he settled in London until his death. Karl Marx took advantage of two Western intellectual traditions. The first is the German idealist philosophy, which was then embodied at its clearest in the philosophy of Hegel. And the second is the British utilitarian economic thought. Karl Marx combined and synthesized these two traditions, these two philosophies, to advance a theory which vows to explain or to expose, to unveil the nature of capitalism. But what Karl Marx intended to do or hoped to do is more than that. It's very important to understand Marxism as Karl Marx himself conceives of his work, not only as a theory or as a philosophy, but also as a political program, which serves as a manifesto or as a rallying cry, as a battle cry for the working class, that is, for the proletariat, as Marx calls them, to unite and get together to undermine, to eradicate, to eliminate the capitalist system. As Karl Marx put it in one of his works, philosophers before him have hitherto, that is, up to now, interpreted the world. The idea, however, for Karl Marx is to change it. Not only to interpret it, to understand it, to examine it, but also to change it. Change does not occur for Karl Marx, change does not occur through mere reflection or through mere reformation, that is, through minor changes or partial changes of the system, but through radical revolution. Revolution is the only means for change, and the understanding of the workings of capitalism is a necessary introduction and a prelude to that radical change or to that revolution, which could only happen when the working class come to arrive at a historical consciousness of their own position as an oppressed class. We'll explain that further in the coming audio recordings. The second question. Okay. For Marx, history should be explained by examining the material conditions of existence in each period. Why does he mean? Okay, so what does he mean? Not why does he mean. That's a typo mistake, so please correct it. Well, to understand Marxism, we have to grasp the notion of historical materialism. Historical materialism is the methodology which informs and which lies at the heart of Marxism. By using this notion, that is, the notion of historical materialism, Karl Marx puts forward two basic ideas. The first is that human history has been moving forward, or rather upward, in a progressive manner, that is, in a linear way. In other words, human history has been evolving through definite stages in the past, before it came to the present stage, which is for Karl Marx capitalism. And after capitalism, it will definitely move on and evolve into two other definite stages before it comes to a halt. Second idea is that there is no other way of scientifically explaining or understanding human history and its evolution except by studying and examining the material conditions of existence in each period. Okay, let's wait a minute. What does Karl Marx mean by the material conditions of existence? In simple terms, he means the historic economic conditions which were prevailing in each period. That is, each period was influenced by and shaped by the prevailing economic condition in that period. Economy is very central then, and is very pivotal to understand the evolution of human history. What is Karl Marx keen on doing here is to reject metaphysical explanations of human history which were prevalent before him. Before Karl Marx, before the advent of Marxism, people used to explain human history through, for example, the evolution of ideas. That is, ideas influence certain ideas have been so influential to the extent of bringing about or generating change. Or, for example, human history used to be also the evolution of human history or events in human history used to be explained through or by referring to the impact or the influence of great people, great intellectuals, philosophers, prophets even, and people of genius. So all of these amount to metaphysical explanations which are for Karl Marx not scientific. A scientific explanation for Karl Marx is necessarily a material explanation, and the material explanation of the conditions of existence is for Karl Marx and the economic conditions which were prevailing in each period. So to understand, for example, the stage of slavery, or we have to understand or to analyze and to examine the conditions, the material conditions, that is, the economic conditions which were prevalent at that period. Who owned the land and who did not, and what relationships, right, ensue out of these economic conditions. I hope that's clear. Good afternoon, everybody. In this audio recording, I briefly outline the Marxist view, or rather the classical Marxist view of ideology, which pretty much answers the 5th, 6th, and 7th questions in our task. Well, the bare bones of the classical Marxist view of ideology boils down to 3 basic ideas. To begin with, we find the clearest and plainest articulation of Karl Marx's view of ideology in his book, The German Ideology, which he wrote in 1846, 2 years before the Communist Manifesto, which he co-authored with his friend Friedrich Engels. In this book, that is in The German Ideology, Karl Marx equates ideology with the ideas of the ruling class. In his own words, the ruling ideas at any given epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. That is to say that the dominant ideas at any given age are the ideas of the class which owns the means of production. For example, under the slavery system, the class which owns the means of production were the masters. Under the feudal system, the landowners and the aristocracy. And under the capitalist system, they were the bourgeoisie, or they are the bourgeoisie, since we are still living, according to Marx, under the capitalist system, late capitalism, as it came to be called. In other words, or just put differently, the ideas, the beliefs, and the value systems of people at any given age are nothing more than reflections and expressions of the ideas of the dominant class. As Marx put it differently in the same book, uh, the class which are the dominant material force necessarily become the dominant intellectual force. The second idea, which is key to understanding Marx's conception of ideology, is the idea of the base and superstructure. Karl Marx puts forward the idea or the model of the base superstructure and explains it in his book Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which he wrote later in his life. Karl Marx conceives of social formation in terms of a spatial metaphor. Spatial here is the adjective which comes from space, from place, spatial metaphor. So think of it as a house which is composed of two levels, two stories. At the basic level there is the base, a term which Karl Marx uses to refer to the mode of production. The mode of production, remember, refers to both means of production, that is the tools, technology, and the things which we use to produce both our means of subsistence and commodities, and the relations of production, which are power structures, the relationship between those who own the means of production and those who don't. To leave aside the Marxist jargon and terminology, let's just think of it simply as the social economic structure. The base is the social economic structure. At the upper level, there is a superstructure. The superstructure again includes ideas, beliefs, system of values, politics, law, media, literature, art, religion, and culture. So what is intriguing in the Marxist view is the relationship between these two, between the base and superstructure. So according to Marx, the base always and necessarily determines and shapes the superstructure. In other words, our ideas, according to Marx, ideas, politics, law, legal codes, literature, what we write, what we believe in, are always, culture, generally speaking, are necessarily determined by, regulated by our social economic reality. Which means that our ideas and consciousness is never, according to Marx, is never autonomous, is never independent. It is necessarily a reflection of an expression of the social economic reality, the dominant modes of production. As Karl Marx put it himself, it is in one very often quoted statement, it is not the consciousness of people that determines their social being. It is their social being that determines their consciousness. It is not consciousness, what we think, what we believe in, that determines our realities, our social realities. It's the opposite, quite the opposite. It's our social and economic realities which determine what we believe in, our system of values, what we write, what we produce, what we think of, and what we produce, politically speaking, legally, and philosophically, intellectually, culturally. So that's it for the second idea. The third idea, which is also key to grasping Karl Marx's view of ideology, addresses this question. How does ideology function? Or what role does ideology play under the capitalistic system? Karl Marx argues that the proletariat, or the working class, suffers from a state of false consciousness. Karl Marx uses the phrase false consciousness to describe the fact that political institutions, legal institutions, religious beliefs, the dominant system of values, intellectual and artistic productions, or the dominant ideas, generally speaking, prevent the working class from recognizing the conditions of exploitation under which they live and from which they suffer. Not only that, not only does ideology make the working class blind to the real material conditions in which they live, but also prevents them from coming to terms or becoming aware of their position as working class. That is so because for Karl Marx, ideology hides, masks, covers, and conceals the real material conditions in the capitalistic system, in which the working class or the workers sell their labor to the bourgeoisie, who in turn make huge profits out of it, to the detriment of the workers, of course. Also, Karl Marx, so in this sense, Karl Marx counterposes class consciousness or false consciousness to class consciousness. By class consciousness, Karl Marx means the moment or the state at which workers come to recognize their position as a working class, which have common feelings and common interests, and who are aware that they should unite and put their hands in the hands of each other to proceed and overthrow the bourgeoisie. Hence, the memorable words of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto: workers of all lands unite. يا عمال العالم اتحدوا. That's it. Take, for example, the idea of the divine rights of kings in the medieval ages. The idea that the king is the representative of God on his earth, corroborated by religion and preached by the church. The idea of the divine rights of the kings largely contributed to maintain the absolute right of monarchs, our absolute rule of monarchs in the Middle Ages, and to legitimate their absolute rights to confiscate the lands, to enslave the serfs and the peasants, and to exploit their labor. To the men and women who were living in the Middle Ages, the idea that our society, where life is essentially inherently hierarchical, and that some people have absolute privileges, absolute rights to rule and do whatever they want to do, is commonsensical and seems commonsensical and seems natural, to the extent that they deterred so many people in the Middle Ages from standing up against absolute monarchy and the realized aristocracy, to reclaim their rights and to raise their voices against conditions of misery and oppression. Not far from this example, another example of ideology which is not far from this example is the idea that the conditions of exploitation and circumstances of oppression and suppression in this life are but reflections of the will of God. Whatever happens in this life is an expression of the will of God. And all one can do, if he is oppressed or exploited, is to wait until the hereafter, where he shall be rewarded by God, because God is the just, the all-knowing, and the almighty. In of course, in the Quran and our Islamic religion, this idea is only half true. Only half of the truth is stated here. The other half of truth is that the Quran condemns people who submit to the will of tyrants and oppressors, and God even punishes those who are willingly submitting to the oppressors and tyrants. I remember one verse from Surah Nisa, the women in the Quran, which says, if I just remember, قالوا فيما كنتم قالوا كنا مستضعفين في الأرض قالوا ألم تكن أرض الله واسعة فتهاجروا فيها. We were oppressed in the land. The angels will say, was not the earth of God so spacious or spacious enough for you to immigrate in it? So another example of ideology is the modern idea that which underpins the capitalistic system, the idea that our social world is essentially individualistic and competitive. If rich people are rich and successful because they believe in individualism, and because they are self-dependent and self-reliant, and also because they are smart and far more competitive than other people. On the contrary, poor people, workers, and those who happen to be at the bottom of the hierarchical scheme are poor and unsuccessful because they lack those qualities, because they are not relying on themselves, they are not smart, and they are not competitive enough. That's why they lag behind. Yeah, so let me conclude with this idea. For Karl Marx, ideology, he equates culture with ideology, but ideology is not restricted to religious ideas, of course. For Karl Marx, ideology is, or religion is the opium of the people. But the same can be said of ideas of race, of sex, of gender, and all the ideas which prevent the working class from recognizing the situation of exploitation which they suffer from and which they endure, and also which deter them from recognizing their status or their position as an exploited class. So we'll talk about that later on. So to sum up quickly, the ruling ideas in a given epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. Number two, the ideas of the ruling class or express their material interests. Number three, the social and material reality determines and shapes the superstructure that is culture, politics, media, etc. Remember, Karl Marx says it is not the consciousness that determines the social being of people, but the social being of people that, which determines their consciousness. And number three, culture, which plays the role of ideology, perpetuates and legitimates the prevailing relations of production. That is, culture maintains in the form of media or ideas, religious beliefs, whatever, maintains the prevailing system of inequalities in society. Question number 8. What do you think about a Marxist analysis of culture, ideology? Is it still relevant today? If yes, in what ways? Well, that's an open-ended question. I'll leave the answer to you, and I'm looking forward to your comments, views, and ideas on the comments section on Google Classroom platform. Thank you.